Hey everybody, this is Travis. Just a little update here. Got the Les Paul laid out on a, as you can tell, very low bench. This is actually the bench for this little organ here. We're going to go through a little bit of spot checking on the fretboard. There are some high frets, and we want to dress them so that they get a little bit lower. This isn't enough to require a full-on fret level, but spot leveling can be a frustrating process, particularly if you're chasing buzzes up and down the neck. So I'm going to show a few different ways that I approach it to try and avoid having that happen, because it is truly a frustrating thing. One thing that I do when I'm spot leveling is I always do it with strings on now. I didn't used to. I would mark D string, whatever. I have found that I just prefer doing it with the strings on. For one thing, you can just test it in real time, so this is my approach to doing that. I guess before we get started, I'll go through a list of the tools that I use for this. You can find purpose-built tools like at StewMac. I don't have those. I bought most of these when I didn't have the money for StewMac tools, and I've just gotten used to using them. So here's a plain old aluminum 24-inch straight edge. Here's a machinist square. They're about $5 at a hardware store. I have my Sharpie, obviously 5/16 for adjusting the truss rod, some 400 grit sandpaper, masking tape. You'll see where these come in later, and this, which is probably the cheapest of all tools. This is a piece of aluminum channel, picked up at a hardware store. I actually had to cut off the piece a little bit, but and then you basically, all you do is you just flatten out the bottom on whatever it is you would use for a full fret level, to make sure that it's perfectly flat. This is what I use for spot leveling. I wouldn't recommend leaning too hard into it, because aluminum does bend pretty easily, and you don't want to have a bent leveling tool, otherwise your leveling will not be level. So, first thing that I do, I have it set up roughly about the height where I can play this pretty decently. This is about as well as I can set this up right now with the neck and everything as it is. I check the relief. On these, typically I will, right about where the body joint is, maybe in the 15th to 17th frets, I'll fret that, and then the first fret, and then I'll just check how much relief there is in the middle. I don't break out the feeler gauges. There's really no point in measuring that. I just eyeball it, and if it seems high, I lower it, or, it's not that tricky. We're not putting men in space here. This is just setting up a guitar. Either it works or it doesn't, right? So going through that, I can see, okay, so that's basically my starting point is normal relief, relatively normal height. Always keep a pick, because the more differently you play it from actual playing, the less likely it is to behave the way you're used to. So like plucking the string will cause it to oscillate differently than picking the string. Just something to bear in mind, particularly when you're getting into pretty tight tolerances on these things. So what I do from there, I just go through and I play. And of course, when I've been playing before, I've already identified what are really the big trouble areas. In this case, the 10th fret, I'll just play high E. It isn't so bad. Bending, you can hear it starts to get a little funky. B string's a little zingy. D seems okay-ish, but A not great. E is so-so. So we know that one is not great. And so then we go up to other areas. I had identified the high frets on the low E strings, so 22nd. I'm just basically just starting at the top, moving backward. So everything north of the 15th fret seems okay. The 13th and 12th are a little rattly. And so that seems largely all right. Same thing, high E. Okay, 7th fret's a little funky there. So what I do when I identify a spot, okay, so 7th fret is zingy. So if it zings when I'm playing the 7th, that means the 8th fret is probably a little bit high. Okay, so you do that. Keep moving down. Your high fret is usually 1 to 2 frets higher, but we'll find more about that here in a moment. So just keep working your way up, and then marking spots as they're found to be sort of a problem. What we do from there, I break out this guy. This is StewMac has a tool called the Fret Rocker, which probably does this maybe a little better, but I've found that this is sufficient. You may or may not be able to hear that, but you can hear the high fret, hear it rocking on the high fret. You can certainly feel it. Okay, now I'm going to go for this 8th fret here. Well, not too bad. Just a little bit. All right, and then I'll check my high frets here, or my up the neck. There's nothing too bad further up here. All right, now what I'm going to do is actually flatten the neck completely and then do another check. So with that, I am just going to tighten up my truss rod. This is probably about a quarter turn out. I check it with the string. See if there's any string movement towards the middle of the neck. Tighten it a skosh more. Give her a bit of a tweak, and that's pretty close. Then I double check it with my straight edge here and see if I can find any light between the top of the bead of the fret and the bottom of my straight edge. All right, looks good. All right, now readjust myself a bit here. Okay, now what I'm going to do is actually just go through, since we have this straightened out. That will make all of my trouble spots that much more pronounced. So I go through and I check it again. So I've already identified the slightly troublesome spots. Now that there's zero relief in the neck, they're really troublesome, and I can even maybe pick out a couple of more. Okay, so right in here, and this is, I mentioned in the previous video, this is towards the middle of the adjustable range of the neck. So this is right around that area where the neck bends when you put a little relief in it. We'll see how that 8th fret looks here. It doesn't rock a lot. How about the 9th? Because sometimes when it gets really low, it might zing on the fret. It's a couple of frets up. It may not be the fret immediately next to it. So you want to check that. You want to check your markings, and you always want to check your rocking before you start sanding away at anything, because you can sand away on something and just, this is how you start chasing buzzes up the neck, when you're sanding away on things that you don't need to be messing with. In this case, so we have the 10th fret here is a problem, right? See, on the 10th it's okay, 11th okay, 12th okay, 9th, 8th, 7th. So everything back from there is a bit of a problem. So 10th fret, probably a big deal. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to prepare this little item with this sandpaper. Basically what I'm going to be doing is cutting the sandpaper and wrapping this in a particular way. So I'm going to have the grit out in the middle and in on the ends. So we have a consistent thickness when it sits on the fretboard. Okay, here I have my little prepared, I'm sitting here dropping it all over the place, little prepared leveler. Now what I did, I took a piece of 400 grit sandpaper. It doesn't really need to be that aggressive. We aren't taking down a lot of material. And it's nickel silver. It's not the hardest material in the world. And we don't want to be super aggressive with it. So 400 grit, not very aggressive. I took a piece of sandpaper, so it's wrapped. You see, this is just regular masking tape here. And I cut it into 3 pieces. One piece in the middle has the grit outwards facing. Then the other 2 pieces have the grit inward facing. This is so that we have the same thickness on the bottom of the little leveling block. Otherwise, we could tend to take a fret that's a little bit proud and just sit and work on it until it's just a little low. So we don't want that. We want to have a consistent thickness on this the whole way throughout. So what I do then, if I find a treble spot on a fret, for example right here, we'll say, I'll work a little bit on this 10th fret. Just for an example. See where that, here's the 10th fret. You see, I can see my Sharpie where I'd marked it, and there's the sandpaper. So we'll just mark that down. So you know that the center, this is the sandpaper. And actually, just for the sake of a visual here, I will mark the, where the sandpaper starts and stops, so that you can see what we're doing here. Okay, so here's my troublesome fret right here on the 10th fret. So I am just running it along. See that? I'm not letting the grit, the sandpaper, get onto the other frets. We're just running along that edge. You can see on the fret itself, you're taking off the Sharpie. Now, normally I won't start in the middle of the neck. Actually, if I have any high spots, I start on the highest frets, work my way backwards. Why is that? Because if number 12 is high, right, and I think number 10 is high, I want to make sure I have 12 out of the way so that when I lower 10, it's not just zinging on 12. You see what I mean? So if you start up here, you take care of these high spots, you won't get any false positives for further down. So you can just keep checking, and you wind up chasing buzzes less. So I'm going to stop the video now because basically that is the technique. Just basically starting up here, let's say, and I don't really have any trouble spots on the high frets up here. But if I did, I would basically just start, say, let's say the 17th is a problem, so I'll, do the 17th and so on and so forth all the way down. So I'm not going to show that whole thing. I'm going to go through, do my spot checks, and then show you sort of the how I check it afterward, and we'll move on from there. All right, back again. Now, where I am right now with this, I have started, as I had mentioned, from the higher frets, working on my high spots, moving it down. One thing I always want to check, if you've been doing this over a relatively short time span, is the amount of bow in the neck. Namely because if you adjust the truss rod, the neck doesn't completely shift right when you're doing it. So you may overcorrect, you may undercorrect. So while you're working, you want to take your straight edge and put it against your fretboard. Also check on the strings just to see that the neck is perfectly straight. Because if you wind up with any back bow in it, you'll start right around mid-neck, probably like on this guitar, you were probably right around the 7th fret. You'll start getting a lot of zinginess and buzzing that you may think is a high fret that you're discovering because the thing is flat and you've maybe lowered the action a bit to test it out, and in actuality it's just because your neck is back bowed. So you don't want to do that, because then you can just be filing relief into your neck, sort of, and making a lot more work for yourself than you need to do. So keep checking that. Work from the highest frets to the lowest frets, and don't be too aggressive with it. I would say, get it to where you can have the action relatively low, and I'll just do a quick run down here. Got that zinginess mostly worked out. I've actually put the relief back into the neck. It's not a whole lot of relief. It's actually, if we look, it's still pretty flat. Still pretty flat. And I actually lowered the action a little bit. So it plays pretty nicely right now. So what you can do at this point, there's no real sense in recrowning. I didn't take off enough material with this little guy with some 400 grit sandpaper. You can see here. The sandpaper is kind of loaded up a little bit with some nickel silver, but we didn't really adjust the shapes of the crowns very much at all. It would be pretty imperceptible, especially on frets that have been played on and played in somewhat. What you can do at this point, if you want, you can go through and you can I would say on the next string change you can steel wool it. What I personally do is for my own guitars, I just play the thing for about an hour. And because the steel strings are so much harder than the nickel silver frets, that just polishes them up. And then when I have the strings off for the next string change, then maybe I'll touch them up with some steel wool or something. But generally, playing on them with nickel frets, that's fine. If you're doing it for someone else, if you're going to be running it out the door, that's a different thing. Then you'll take off the strings, then you'll maybe run a little bit finer grits on it, or I really do think the steel wool thing generally takes that out, because a 400 grit scratch isn't that profound of a scratch in a fret surface. So generally you can play right through that. It's not like that's going to be causing its own problems. If you were taking a file to it, for example, on a freshly fretted neck, I will generally go after it with I have a fine flat mill file that I'll use to just get everything knocked down initially. That's a little bit too rough to kind of play your way out of. But 400 grit sandpaper isn't really that rough, and you can polish that up pretty quickly. If you want with the strings on it, for example, you can take this, you can put 600 or 800, 1,000 grit or whatever you want to do. I personally, like I said, for my own stuff, I don't see the need. But if it was a repair that I'm doing for someone else, then I would polish them up before I send it out the door. So anyway, right now I'm pretty happy with the way the frets are sitting on this thing. Next thing up is going to be the nut, which will might be a tough nut to crack. No. But yeah, next up will be the nut. A couple of options on that. I actually have a chunk of bone remaining from the last couple of guitar builds that I did. If it's a wide enough piece, I haven't measured it, I'll replace the nut with that. If not, I guess I'll order a chunk of bone for a nut. So anyway, that'll be the next installment. Thanks. Bye.